I have lived long enough and sat with enough human souls in the quiet of my consulting room to recognize a particular kind of exhaustion the moment it walks through the door. It does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive weeping or trembling or with the visible marks of acute suffering that the untrained eye associates with genuine pain. It arrives quietly. It arrives wearing the composed face of someone who has been holding themselves together for so long that holding together has become indistinguishable from simply existing. It sits across from me, and it folds its hands, and it says, in one form or another, words that I have heard in every language, from every kind of person, across more decades of practice than I care to count. It says, I do not understand why he will not choose me. I never rushed to answer that question directly. In my experience, the direct answer to a question like that is rarely the answer the person actually needs. What they need, first, is to understand what they have been doing while they waited for him to choose. Because the waiting, I observed again and again, is never passive. It only appears passive from the outside. From the inside, the waiting is the most exhausting and consuming activity a human psyche can engage in. It is a full-time occupation of the spirit, and it has a name, though most people who are deep inside it resist the name when I offer it. I call it chasing. You have been chasing him. Perhaps you have dressed it in the more dignified clothing of patience or devotion, or simply refusing to abandon something that felt, in its first moments, like the most honest thing you had ever allowed yourself to feel. I do not dismiss that feeling. I never dismissed feelings in my work. I argued, against considerable opposition from my contemporaries, that feelings are not the obstacle to understanding. They are the very substance of it. But feelings, when they are not met with corresponding honesty from the other side, have a tendency to curdle, to transform, slowly and without announcement, into something that no longer resembles love, as much as it resembles pursuit. And pursuit, I observed in my patience, with a consistency that eventually stopped surprising me, does something very specific to the psychology of the person being pursued. It removes from him the one experience that would have forced him to grow. I will return to that, because what it removes, and why its removal matters more than anything else in this dynamic, is the thread that holds this entire story together. But before I can take you there, I must take you somewhere more uncomfortable first. I must take you into your own interior, into the part of yourself that you have been most carefully avoiding while you directed all of your attention outward toward him. I called it the shadow. Not in the literary sense, not as a poetic convenience. The shadow, as I developed the concept across my life's work, is the repository of everything the conscious mind refuses to examine directly. Not only the darkness, though the darkness lives there too, but the need, the specific, humbling, deeply human need to be chosen by this particular person, not because he is objectively the only person capable of loving you well, but because something inside you, something that was shaped long before he arrived, decided that his choosing would resolve something that has never been resolved, something old, something that has been waiting with extraordinary patience for exactly this kind of person to arrive and make the resolution feel possible. That something is not a flaw in you. I want to be precise about that, because imprecision here causes damage. It is not weakness. It is not evidence of some fundamental deficiency in your character or your psychology. It is evidence that you are human, that you arrived in this life, as every human being does, carrying the unfinished emotional business of every experience that shaped you before you had the language or the agency to process it consciously. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the unexamined self. And the unexamined self, as I wrote and lectured and argued across an entire career, does not disappear because we refuse to look at it. It deepens, it grows more insistent, it finds increasingly creative ways to make itself known. And one of its most reliable methods is to attach itself to another person and call the attachment love. This is not an accusation. It is a map, and I offer it as a map, because maps are only useful when the person holding one is willing to look honestly at where they actually stand, rather than where they had hoped to be standing by now. You had hoped, by this point in the story, that he would have moved toward you, that the distance would have closed, that something in his behavior would have confirmed what you felt in the beginning. In those early moments when the connection seemed to move in both directions, with an ease that felt, if I may use the word without sentimentality, like recognition. Instead, he went quiet, and in that quiet, something began to happen inside you that I recognize with the clarity of a man who has spent a lifetime watching it happen. The pursuit intensified. The reaching became more frequent, even as it became more carefully disguised as casualness. The internal monitoring, the constant, exhausting surveillance of his behavior for any signal that the distance was narrowing, became the primary occupation of your waking hours and a significant portion of your sleeping ones. And underneath all of it, buried beneath the hope and the longing and the careful maintenance of the appearance of dignity, a question formed that you have not allowed yourself to ask too directly, because to ask it directly is to risk an answer you are not yet prepared to receive. The question is not whether he will come back. The question is what you will finally see about yourself the moment you stop waiting for him to. That moment is closer than you think, and what it reveals about you, about him, about the precise psychological mechanism that will cause something very close to panic to move through him the instant he realizes the pursuit has genuinely ended, is what I intend to lay before you, with the full honesty that my years of work have taught me is the only thing that actually helps. But before we go further, if something in these words has already reached a place inside you that you have been protecting for a long time, share this with someone who is still deep inside the chase and has not yet found the stillness to stop. Stay with me, because what I have observed about what happens inside a man the moment the chasing stops is not what you have been told, and it begins in a place inside him that he has worked very hard to make sure neither of you would ever have to look at directly. I want to tell you about a patient I saw early in my career. I will not give you her name, because the consulting room demands a privacy I honored in life and intend to honor still. But I will tell you enough. She was a woman of considerable intelligence and genuine emotional depth. She had been involved with a man who moved toward her with an intensity that she described in our first session as unlike anything she had previously experienced. He pursued her. He was present. He was warm in a way that felt, she said, almost unfamiliar, as though she had spent her life receiving a diluted version of attention, and he had arrived offering the concentrated form of it. And then, gradually, he withdrew. Not all at once. That is rarely how it happens, and the gradual nature of the withdrawal is, I observed, a significant part of what makes it so psychologically destabilizing. If a man simply vanished overnight, the psyche could grieve cleanly. It could locate the ending, mourn it, and begin the slow work of reorganization. But the gradual withdrawal offers no clean location for the grief. It offers instead a continuous series of almost enoughs, a message that arrives just frequently enough to prevent the acceptance of silence, a warmth that surfaces just long enough to reactivate the hope that had almost settled into something quieter. She came to me, as so many did, not in the immediate aftermath of a clear ending, but in the accumulated exhaustion of a story that refused to end clearly. She had been chasing him for 14 months. I did not tell her to stop chasing. That is not how I worked, and it is not, in my considered opinion, how this kind of interior work can be done effectively. You cannot instruct a person out of a psychological pattern that is rooted beneath the level of conscious choice. You can only illuminate the root. And when I began to illuminate the root of what was driving her pursuit, what we found there was not what she had expected to find. It was not simply love. It was not even primarily love, though love was genuinely present. What was driving the chase, at its deepest and most honest level, was something I had seen in patient after patient across the years. Something I had, if I am being fully truthful with you, seen in myself during periods of my own life that I examined with the same unflinching attention I brought to the work. It was the unmet animus. I developed the concept of the animus across many years of clinical observation and theoretical refinement. In the simplest terms I can offer without doing injustice to its complexity, the animus is the internalized masculine principle that lives within every woman's psychology. It is not a man. It is an archetypal image, a composite constructed from every experience of masculine energy, absorbed across an entire life, beginning as all the most formative things do. In the earliest years, before conscious memory has the organizational capacity to file the experiences in any kind of rational order, the father who was present or absent, the first experience of being seen or overlooked by a boy whose opinion, for reasons the child could not have articulated, felt disproportionately significant. Every story ever absorbed about what men are, what they want, what their attention means, and what its withdrawal signals about the worth of the person receiving it. The animus, when it remains unconscious, when it has not been examined and understood and integrated into the broader self, does something that I found endlessly fascinating and endlessly problematic in equal measure. It projects, it takes its internalized image of the masculine, and it casts that image outward onto real men, real, specific, flawed, complicated human men who may or may not resemble the projection in any meaningful way. And when a man arrives who matches the projection closely enough, who carries in his particular combination of qualities and contradictions, something that resonates with the blueprint the animus has been holding, the recognition that occurs is not merely romantic attraction. It is something far older and far more consuming than that. This is why, When I ask you honestly whether you have ever stopped to examine what specifically it is about him that feels so irreplaceable, so non-negotiable, the answer that rises first is almost never a clear and rational list of his actual qualities. The answer that rises first is a feeling, a sense, a certainty that does not have adequate language, but insists on itself regardless. That certainty, I want you to understand, is the animus speaking, and the animus, in its unexamined state, is not a reliable narrator. It is a deeply motivated one, with its own agenda, its own wounds, and its own definition of resolution that has very little to do with your conscious happiness, and a great deal to do with the completion of an old and unfinished story. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer it immediately, because the immediate answer is almost always the defended one. When you imagine him finally choosing you, fully, unambiguously, without the withdrawal and the silence and the almost enoughs, what is the feeling beneath the relief? Not the relief itself, beneath it. What is the older, quieter feeling that the relief would finally allow you to put down? Take your time with that. Write it in the comments if you are willing, because what you find beneath the relief is not about him at all. And that discovery, when it arrives with full clarity, is the beginning of the only shift that actually matters in this story. Because here is what I observed with my patient across the months of our work together. As she began to understand the animus, as she began to see the projection clearly and to separate the real man from the image she had overlaid upon him, something unexpected happened. She stopped chasing, not as a decision exactly, not as a strategy, more as a natural consequence of no longer being driven by something she could not see. The compulsion simply lost its fuel when the unconscious mechanism powering it was brought into the light, and within 3 weeks of her stopping, he contacted her. I did not present this to her as a victory. I want to be precise about that, because the temptation in that moment is to interpret his return as confirmation that the love was real, that the waiting was justified, that the correct lesson is simply to wait long enough, and they always come back. That interpretation, I told her directly, would be the most expensive mistake she could make with the information, because his return was not evidence of love. Not yet. His return was evidence of something else entirely, something that was happening inside his psychology the moment the pursuit ended, something that has a name and a mechanism and a root that runs just as deep as everything we had uncovered in hers. He was not returning because he had resolved anything inside himself. He was returning because something inside him had begun, for the first time, to panic. And the panic, I want you to understand, did not begin the day she stopped reaching out. It began earlier than that, in a place inside him that had been carefully, methodically, almost professionally sealed off from his own conscious awareness. It began in his shadow, in the part of his psychology that he had organized his entire adult life around never having to examine directly. And what lives in that sealed place, what her pursuit had been allowing him to avoid confronting, and what her stopping suddenly forced to the surface, is the piece of this that changes everything you thought you understood about why he behaves the way he does. We are going to go there next, into his interior. into the specific architecture of what he has been protecting and why its protection has cost him more than he has ever allowed himself to calculate. But before we do, stay with me, because the most important part of what I observed in 40 years of sitting with men in that consulting room is not what they said. It was what they could not say, what they circled around and approached and retreated from with the dedication of someone who understands on some wordless level that saying it would require them to become someone they are not yet sure they are capable of being. That is where we are going. I want to tell you something about men that most people who study them get wrong, not because they lack intelligence or genuine curiosity about the subject, but because they make the same foundational error that I spent the first decade of my career making myself before the weight of clinical evidence forced me to revise my assumptions with the humility that good science demands. The error is this: they look at what a man does, and they attempt to understand him from the outside in. They observe the withdrawal, the silence, the inconsistency, the push and pull of a man who moves toward a woman with warmth and then retreats without adequate explanation. And they construct their theories of his behavior from those observable surface patterns. I learned, eventually, to go in the other direction entirely, not from the behavior inward, from the interior outward. And what I found when I went that direction, when I sat with men not as subjects to be categorized, but as souls to be understood in the full complexity of what they carried beneath the surface they presented to the world, was something that surprised me initially, and then, with repetition, became the most reliable map I possessed for understanding masculine withdrawal in intimate connection. What I found was fear. Not the fear that announces itself, not the fear that a man would recognize and name if you asked him directly what he was feeling in the moments he pulled away from a woman who genuinely loved him. That fear, the named and conscious kind, he might have been able to work with. He might have been able to bring it into a conversation, to offer it as an explanation, to allow it to become a point of genuine contact between himself and the person he was withdrawing from. The fear I found in men was older than that, and far less cooperative. It was the fear that had been so thoroughly integrated into the architecture of the personality that the man carrying it had long since stopped experiencing it as fear, and had begun experiencing it simply as himself. I called it the persona. The persona is the mask, not a mask in the pejorative sense, not a deliberate deception constructed with cynical intent. The persona is the functional self that a person develops in response to the demands of the world they grew up in. It is adaptive. It is, in its own way, intelligent. It learns with extraordinary efficiency what the environment rewards and what it punishes, and it shapes itself accordingly. For most of the men I sat with across my career, the environment of their formation had rewarded a very specific and very narrow range of emotional expression, strength, competence, self-sufficiency, the appearance of needing nothing and no one beyond what could be obtained through individual effort and will. And it had punished with a consistency that left marks I could still find decades later, the expression of need itself. Not the fact of need. Men need. Every human being needs. The need for connection, for being known, for being held in genuine regard by another person. This need does not disappear because the environment refuses to honor it. It goes underground. It finds the deepest and most inaccessible room in the interior of the self, and it takes up residence there, behind the persona. Behind the competence and the self-sufficiency and the carefully maintained appearance of a man who requires nothing he has not already provided for himself. And there it waits, with a patience that I found, across the years, both remarkable and heartbreaking, because what it waits for is exactly what you offered him. You offered him genuine seeing, not the seeing that his persona invited, not the admiration of his competence, or the comfort of his strength, or the social confirmation of the image he had spent years constructing and maintaining. You offered him something his interior had been waiting for with that patient, underground hunger, since long before he had any conscious awareness of the waiting. You saw something in him that lived beneath the persona. You responded to it. You made it feel, for perhaps the first time in his adult experience, not only safe to surface, but actively welcomed, and that is precisely when he began to retreat. I know that feels like a contradiction. I know that the mind, encountering that sequence of events, wants to reject it as irrational. He was seen, genuinely and warmly seen, and his response was to withdraw from the seeing. How does that make sense? It makes complete sense, I assure you, when you understand what genuine seeing costs a man who has built his entire psychological architecture around remaining unseen in the places that matter most. Because being seen in those places does not only feel like warmth and recognition, it feels like exposure, like the sudden removal of the walls he built, not to keep you out, but to keep the unexamined parts of himself in. Parts that he made an unconscious agreement with himself, very early in his life, he would never be required to face. Your love broke that agreement, not violently, not with any intention on your part beyond the simple and honest expression of what you felt. But the impact was violent in the interior sense, in the way that genuine light is violent when it enters a space that has been sealed in darkness long enough that the darkness began to feel like the natural state. He did not retreat from you. This is the distinction I want to press upon you, with everything I have, because the failure to understand it is the source of most of the suffering I witnessed in women who came to me, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man's withdrawal. He did not retreat from you. He retreated from himself. From the version of himself that your love was making it impossible for him to continue hiding, from the wounds your presence illuminated without your having any idea that illumination was occurring, from the needs your warmth activated that his persona had spent years classifying as inadmissible. You were not the threat. You were the mirror. And the mirror showed him something that his psychological defenses were not yet equipped to integrate without the whole carefully constructed edifice of the persona beginning to crack in ways he could neither predict nor control. So he did what the persona does when it feels the foundations shifting beneath it. He created distance, and in the distance, something settled back into its familiar arrangement inside him. The persona reasserted itself. The needs went back underground. The walls rebuilt themselves with the efficiency of structures that have been constructed and reconstructed many times before, and on the surface he projected the image of a man who had simply moved on, who was fine, who was, if anything, perhaps slightly relieved to have returned to the more manageable emotional temperature of a life lived behind the mask. But underneath that surface, and this is what I observed with a consistency across decades that eventually elevated it from clinical observation to something I would call psychological law. Underneath that surface, something was happening that the persona could not reach and could not quiet and could not rebuild its walls around, no matter how much structural effort it applied. The need was still there, louder now, not quieter, because you had activated it in a way that mere suppression could no longer adequately address. The hunger for the specific quality of being seen that only you, in his experience, had offered. The hunger that the persona would spend considerable energy denying, while simultaneously, in the unguarded hours, in the early mornings before the daylight, allowed the mask to fully reassemble itself, driving him toward his phone with an urgency he could not rationally justify and could not entirely resist. He was not at peace in the distance. He was managing, which is a very different thing, and the management was costing him more than he had a framework to calculate, because the part of him doing the calculating was the same part that had been told since before he had adequate language to question the instruction, that the cost of need is always greater than the cost of its suppression. That calculation was about to be interrupted because something was changing on your end of this connection, something he had not anticipated and had not, in the comfortable assumption of the pursuing continuing indefinitely, prepared himself for. The pursuit was ending, not as a tactic, not as a strategy dressed in the language of dignity, but as the genuine, quiet, psychologically inevitable consequence of a person who has finally, after long enough, reached the bottom of the energy available for chasing something that does not chase back. You were stopping, and in the moment that stopping became real, not threatened, not performed, but actual, something moved through the carefully managed interior of a man who had organized his entire psychological defense system around the assumption of your continued pursuit, something that the persona had no prepared response for, something that rose from the same sealed room where the need had been living in its patient, underground hunger since long before either of you entered this story. It rose with a speed and an intensity that caught him entirely off guard, and what it felt like from the inside of his psychology was not what you might expect. It was not longing, exactly. It was not even grief, though grief was present in it. What it felt like, in the most honest and precise clinical language I can offer, was the specific and disorienting variety of panic that a person experiences when something they had unconsciously relied upon to remain constant has suddenly, without adequate warning, been revealed as impermanent. The ground had shifted beneath him, and the full weight of what that shift meant for the unexamined interior he had been so carefully protecting was only beginning, in those first moments of your stopping, to make itself known to him. What it would demand of him next, what the panic would force to the surface in the days and weeks that followed, is something that neither his persona nor his carefully managed distance had any precedent for handling. We are going to examine that next, with the precision it deserves, and the honesty that I have always believed is the only genuine kindness available to a person sitting in the middle of a truth they have not yet fully allowed themselves to see. The panic does not arrive in him the way panic arrives in a person who is consciously aware of what they are losing. It does not announce itself with the clarity of a man who looks at his life and thinks with full rational presence, "I've made a grave error, and I must correct it before correction becomes impossible." That kind of panic he could have managed. The persona is extraordinarily well equipped to manage conscious panic. It has protocols for it. It has behaviors rehearsed across a lifetime of situations that required the appearance of composure in the presence of genuine internal disruption. What arrives in him is older than that. And older things, in my clinical experience, do not respond to the persona's management protocols. What arrives is the shadow's panic, the part of him that has been living in the sealed room, the need, the hunger, the specific and irreplaceable quality of being seen that only your presence ever activated in him. That part does not experience your stopping as a strategic shift or a change in relational dynamics. It experiences it the way a person experiences the sudden withdrawal of the only light source in a room they had forgotten was dark, not as an inconvenience, as an emergency, as the activation of something primal and pre-rational that bypasses the persona entirely and moves directly into the body, into the hands that reach for the phone, into the chest that registers your absence as a physical pressure that no amount of distraction or managed distance can adequately relieve. He begins, in those days, to understand something about himself that the pursuit had been allowing him to avoid understanding. He begins to understand that what he felt was not casual, that what he retreated from was not something he had successfully left behind, but something he had been carrying with him into every subsequent hour of every subsequent day, disguised as ordinary life, filing itself under manageable, presenting itself as resolved, while continuing to do its quiet and insistent work in the interior spaces the persona cannot reach. He begins to understand, with the particular and uncomfortable clarity that only genuine loss produces, that the walls he built were not protecting him from you. They were protecting him from the version of himself that your love made visible. And now, without the pursuit to organize his defenses around, without the reliable presence of your reaching to give the persona something to manage and respond to and hold at the comfortable distance that felt like autonomy, the walls serve no function, because the thing they were built to contain is no longer trying to be contained. It is trying to find its way back to the only place it has ever, in his adult experience, felt anything other than suppressed. This is the moment, in my clinical observation, when a man either grows or retreats permanently into the persona. There is no middle path. I want to be honest with you about that. Because false comfort has never been something I was willing to offer in exchange for the easier conversation it would have produced. Some men, when the panic surfaces and the shadow makes its demand, find that the fear of permanent loss is finally larger than the fear of being seen. They move, they reach, they arrive, often imperfectly and without adequate words, at the door they have been standing outside for longer than either of you fully realized. And what they bring when they arrive is not the same thing they carried when they left. It is something that the silence and the panic and the confrontation with their own unexamined interior has refined in ways that comfortable pursuit never could have produced. Others retreat deeper into the persona, further from the sealed room. They choose the known suffering of their own suppression over the unknown risk of genuine exposure. And that choice, I want you to understand, is not a verdict on your worth. It is a verdict on their readiness, which is entirely their own work to do, and entirely outside the territory of anything you were ever responsible for. But here is what I want to leave with you. Here is the truth that I carried out of 40 years of sitting inside the interior worlds of human beings who were brave enough to let me look with them at what they had been most carefully avoiding. The moment you stopped chasing was not the moment you lost him. It was the moment you finally gave him the only genuine opportunity he had ever been offered to find himself. And it was the moment you finally gave yourself the same opportunity. Because the chase had been costing you something too, something I have been waiting across this entire conversation for the right moment to name directly. The chase had been costing you your own interiority, your own shadow work, your own confrontation with the animus, and what it had been projecting, and why and what the projection was asking you to heal in yourself that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with the oldest and most persistent story your psychology has been trying to complete since long before he arrived to play his role in it. That story does not end with him choosing you. It ends with you choosing yourself, with full awareness of what you were chasing and why and what you are worth in the quiet after the chase has finally, completely stopped. That is not a consolation. That is not the lesser prize offered to the person who did not get what they came for. That is, in my considered opinion, after a lifetime of this work, the only arrival that actually changes anything. Everything else is just another form of waiting. If these words have found the place inside you that needed to hear them most, share this with someone who is still running. Follow along, because the conversation that matters most is always the one you are finally willing to have with yourself. You already know where to begin.